Raymond Carver is one of the more controlled writers of his generation. This mid 20th century, mid 20th century postmodernism. With him, it most often takes the form of minimalism. He is known as the great minimalist of his group of writers, where he absolutely strips language down to the barest of minimum, taking an impulse begun in with the Imagist poets in the beginning of the 20th century, and Hemingway and what have you, and just really stripping everything down to just the bare bones of expression. And thus his stories tend to be really short, and you can get through them and not have the least idea what was going on, because everything was supposed to be nuanced. Because one word is placed in one way, that's supposed to carry pretty much the whole story through. So he can be a little bit difficult to get a hold of, but there is great power in that understatement. In Cathedral, the story he wrote in I believe it was the early 80s, not too long before he died, he loosens that up a little bit. You get a lot more words in this. It's a fairly significant little piece of prose, a first person or a first person account of something and of an experience that carries it in that person's words, and so has a certain character and flavor to the language itself. It's much looser. The absolute discipline of his conventional style it doesn't always fit, because it doesn't sound particularly conversational. It doesn't sound like natural language. It sounds like really stripped down written language. But in this, you get a great opportunity for him to show his control and his evocation of a particular voice, the sense of a character just by the words they use. This story is told in the first person, and it is a particularly limited first person. You don't get a lot of access or even speculation about what anybody else might be thinking or doing. It's all very controlled within this one perspective. And the way he opens it, always look at beginnings and endings, the way he opens it demonstrates this right off the bat, where you get a sense of the character just from the way he is speaking. The words he is choosing and the way he's arranging them convey more than just the surface meaning of the words. This blind man, an old friend of my wife's, he was on his way to spend the night. Interesting. First of all, he starts out with this blind man. So automatically, ding, 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 that's a little bit curious. Why is he starting with this? What does blindness have to do with this? We see in James Joyce, in Araby, the mention of blindness in the very first couple of words of a story can signal that, okay, this is going to be about something to do with sight in some form or another, or the lack of it. But also the truncated quality of it. This blind man, an old friend of my wife's, he was on his way to spend the night. There's something very choppy about this style that gives you the sense that this isn't necessarily somebody who is particularly fluent with language. This blind man, an old friend of my wife's, he was on the way. There's something awkward about this. It's not particularly fluent. If an editor got a hold of this for a different purpose, he might say, well, let's rearrange these words to make it a little bit more, let's make it flow. And he's not going for flow here. He's going for something very different, a kind of forced quality, like he doesn't even really want to be telling this story or talking about it. And you get the sense of a great inner tension because of that forced quality to the language makes you think, okay, something's going on underneath that exterior. These words are being, sort of pushed out to the surface, and perhaps they are masking a kind of inner turmoil within. His wife had died, so he was visiting his dead wife's relatives in Connecticut. He called my wife from his in-laws. Arrangements were made. These are all very short, choppy sentences. He would come by train, a 5-hour trip, and my wife would meet him at the station. It's just bare bones information, like he's relaying an itinerary, explaining something in the most surface way imaginable, not trying to make it a pleasant conversation necessarily. He's just trying to express information. That's it. You're not told necessarily how you feel about him right away. It's just, this guy is coming. He's not my friend. He's my wife's. He's coming. And that sense of repetition, that sense of forcing it out, is dramatic. It is very conspicuous. And the fact that, again, it happens right at the beginning of the story suggests that, all right, well, this narrator has some real feelings about this guy coming. There's also a sense in this of not just frustration, but perhaps in the very basic, repetitive, awkward sentence structure, that perhaps this guy isn't necessarily super bright. Maybe he's not, not everybody can be Shakespeare. Maybe he's not comfortable expressing himself in writing or even in speaking. Words aren't his thing. And so you get this kind of awkwardness to it that it suggests that, well, maybe this, maybe this person isn't the sharpest knife in the shed, or whatever it is, sharpest tool in the shed, sharpest knife in the drawer. Maybe he's a little lower class. There's something, a little class-based in this. The voice that comes out is of a fairly angry, frustrated, lesser educated person, probably lower class. But he also dwells on the blindness thing a little bit more. I wasn't enthusiastic about his visit. He was no one I knew, which again is sort of an awkward phrasing. He was no one I knew. It's like, somebody just learning to use language for the first time. And his being blind bothered me. Okay. My idea of blindness came from the movies. In the movies, the blind moved slowly and never laughed. Sometimes they were led by seeing eye dogs. A blind man in my house was not something I looked forward to. Well, a blind man in my house was not something I looked forward to comes just a couple of sentences after him saying, and his being blind bothered me. So again, you get two fairly benign statements that on their own just suggest, like, all right, he's not thrilled about it. But when they keep touching on them, the repetition of that notion that are still very, very forced, benign, the fact that they keep being repeated suggests that, well, maybe he's trying to not say how he really feels about it. Maybe he doesn't know how to say how he really feels about it. But the fact that he just keeps dwelling on this topic of not being crazy about this suggests that there is more frustration underneath. And he's trying to hold that back. but also the sense of his idea of blindness comes from the movies. Well, from the movies, right there, that's sort of a little signal that, well, maybe his ideas are kind of limited. Maybe he's not the most literate person in the world. Maybe he doesn't have that particularly wide association of friends. So maybe his perspective, which is another word for sight, maybe his perspective is limited. He talks about his wife. He's dwelling on this. We are not told her name. She is just his wife, and it's like he can't really even identify her beyond that at this point. It's all in reference to him. The wife seems to be somewhat more literate. She goes and she gets a job reading to the blind man, and that's how they become friends. And this is many years later now. And they say pretty quickly towards the beginning that she used to, that she occasionally writes poems. And just that sense of, well, okay, if she's writing poems, maybe she's dwelling on something a little bit more thoughtful or intellectual or sentimental. But the fact that she writes poems, I think, is important, because poems themselves are generally short, especially in the modern era, fairly short incrustations of language that are meant to be read into, so that the words on the page only suggest something much greater. Especially in the modernist tradition, the words on the page are supposed to be as compact as possible, and so when you delve into them, you suddenly realize, okay, now underneath all of that, there's a whole wellspring of meaning there. And he doesn't get it. He says very clearly, I just don't understand poetry. I admit it's not the first thing I reach for when I pick up something to read. And that's the end of the paragraph. And I can't help but wonder that when you end with something like that, it makes me lead on a little with that thought and think, well, how much does he really read to begin with? Maybe, and what, if anything, does he read? It's making judgments. I'm sitting there judging, all right, maybe this guy's not, again, nothing wrong with it, but he's not necessarily Mr. High Culture. Anyway, this man who first enjoyed her favors, which is a curious little cliche and a trick of language, enjoyed her favors sounds almost sexual. It's supposed to, but you can see it doesn't necessarily, but underneath it seems to be conveying that. The officer-to-be, her ex-husband, he'd been her childhood sweetheart. So, okay. And again, that so okay as a single sentence tells me, all right, maybe this is supposed to be verbal. Maybe this is somebody who's talking. It kind of feels like that instead of writing. But it's also it's very forced. Like, it's just more language that he's trying to get out to express something, but he doesn't really have the tools to express it. She told the blind man she loved her husband, but she didn't like it where they lived, and she didn't like it that he was part of the military-industrial thing. And that's another little cliche there, this little sign, this little structuralist sign, if you really want to go crazy on this, that it's not just words. The military-industrial complex is a term that came out of the Eisenhower era, when the rise of the military and weapons builders was thought to be driving too much U.S. policy and got us into Vietnam. And this is being written in the wake of Vietnam. So the idea that, that the big business of weapons makers and the bureaucrats in the Pentagon, they're all colluding to perpetuate these wars just to make a lot of money and accrue a lot of power for themselves. that's that. But the idea is he's just sort of waving that term. He's not necessarily giving a whole disquisition on Eisenhower foreign policy, but he is waving this little flag, the military-industrial thing, which is a term that carries this whole wealth of meaning that he's just sort of using again as a cliche. And this whole story is packed with cliches. Cliches are just empty language that doesn't really mean anything anymore. Terms and phrases that have that at one point were coined as expressions, but that over time they've just become so overused and so shop-worn, they really don't mean anything much anymore. So they are hollow language. They are language that has nothing underneath it. That is just blather. It's just taking up time and space. Let me see. Other little things that jump out. They exchange tapes. He says, and over the years, she put all kinds of stuff, again, blank terms that don't mean anything, kinds of stuff on tapes, and sent the tapes off lickety-split. Another cliche. But you can see that the idea that they are conversing at all, this expression is driving his resentment. He is returning to it again and again and again. And so this voice starts to take on this somewhat malicious tone where you get the sense again and again and again that these things are bothering him, and he's not coming out and saying it. He's expressing it very clearly to everybody who's listening, but he's never actually saying it. And the hostility that comes through in that distance between what he is saying and what you know he means underneath, the hostility endemic in that, it creates this character, this voice that is one of real nastiness. That is somebody who is really quite angry and frustrated and bubbling over with rage. He feels excluded, left out, and overlooked. And a lot of this has to do with how empty I think he is inside. He is not necessarily a stupid person. He actually has a fairly good eye for, he is not necessarily physically blind, but he has a fairly good eye for detail that starts to pop up at odd points. When he is talking about this blind man who comes to visit and spend an evening with them, he ticks off a lot of details that would probably escape most people, that they just don't notice these things. This blind man was late 40s, heavy-set, balding man with stooped shoulders, and as if he were carrying a great weight there, as if he carried a great weight there. That is interpretation. That is him noting with very specific focus different details of his guest's appearance. It is all surface appearance, but then he goes beyond the surface and interprets a little. I had the feel, as if he carried a great weight there. He is looking beyond the surface. Right before that, which I just sort of jumped on, my wife finally took her eyes off the blind man and looked at me. I had the feeling she didn't like what she saw. He is interpreting her hostility based on the look she gives him. No words have to be exchanged. He can get the message. But also, again, the detail. He wore brown slacks, brown shoes, and a light brown shirt, a tie, a sports coat. Spiffy. This is almost reading like a police description, as if he's, identifying a crime suspect or something. He also had a full beard, but he didn't use a cane, and he didn't use dark glasses. I always thought dark glasses were a must for the blind. Fact was, I wished he had a pair. he gets a little digressive. He starts to wander off topic from time to time. And in this, you can see the verbal quality of this, as if he's just thinking or talking, as opposed to sitting down and really composing. But in this, you also see, as he has something to focus on, the language comes a little bit more smoothly. It feels less forced. It's almost as if once he's given a focus, he can actually look at something and express himself about it. But at first glance, his eyes look like anyone else's eyes. More interpretation, more analogy, and inner appreciation. But if you look close, which is what he's doing here, there was something different about them. Very, very focused at this point. Too much white in the iris, for one thing, and the pupils seemed to move about in its sockets without his knowing or being able to stop it. Creepy. He has the ability to look very closely. This is not necessarily just the meathead that perhaps we have assumed he is so far. He is not necessarily the idiot that he first presented himself to be. As we spend a little time with him, as the reader can look in a little more closely, he starts to look more and more attentive, more and more perceptive, more and more intelligent. There is something there. And the reader can suddenly be accused, perhaps, of jumping to the same superficial conclusions that he so often does, that the narrator so often does. Because if the big crime that this guy seems to be committing again and again and again is that he is making, very superficial judgments about anything, and he just, doesn't seem to pay attention to anything and doesn't think about anything and is basing everything on very surface perspectives. The reader, up until this point, has perhaps been doing the same thing, because now we're suddenly accused, as we're sitting here trying to read, that, maybe we're being a little too we're making snap judgments as well. They start drinking. He has been drinking throughout. You get more of a sense of just, how what this life is like. They are drinking quite a lot. There's a lot of sarcasm getting traded back and forth. There's a real undercurrent of ugliness. There are, some. They're not sitting around and having a pleasant high-level discussion. They're all fairly lower class, lower educated, I get the sense. Well, the blind man, Robert, as we learn very late in the story, his name is, it pops in once at first, and it's kind of curious because it just sort of slips out after being emphatically referenced as the blind man. And then he is introduced as Robert, and we remember, oh yeah, Robert was the name dropped earlier. He seems to be fairly well educated. He travels around quite a bit, apparently, when whatever his line of work is. I forget, but the wife seems to have some background. She's a poet. So there is something there. We really don't know that much about the narrator here. I don't know what he does for a living. I don't know his educational background. You get a sense that a lot of it is just fairly down and out, lower working class culture. And so he expresses some frustration and boredom with a lot of Robert's details of Robert's life. He gets, he seems absolutely, irritated about the story of this of Robert's wife, who has just died. He dwells on the fact that, what could it be? how much could he really miss her? He never saw her. Or what kind of a marriage is that if he was never able to visually see her? There's a he throws out a little hint that perhaps he's packing in some racism there. He takes some affront at her name. There's a real sense of there's some ugliness building here that I really don't want to go into, but again, it is all surface. It is all him just supposing, and he rejects hearing about anything more. It's like, I don't really want to know about the story of their marriage. I don't really care. It's just, as far as he's concerned, it's just a blind man married a woman with cancer, and she died, and that's pretty much it. He doesn't understand that there can be anything more to that. When there's a reference to she was buried with half a Mexican peso or something like that. And the question arises, well, what happened to the other half? And the implications being that there was some sort of a coin or something that that perhaps had some sentimental value, some value beneath the surface, some deeper meaning to these two individuals. And when she died, it was cut in half, and they each kept one half. And that's sort of a touching little sentimental story, and he's just blowing past it. What? I don't get it. No. He's refusing to pay any attention to the details, and these little moments keep slipping out and displaying character, and doing this through the voice that is resistant to anything that could be that could suggest something special beneath the crude surface of things. And so they have this evening together. They eat dinner. There's a lot of drinking going on. At one point, the narrator says, well, hey, do you want to try smoking some pot? And so they pull that out and they start smoking, and things are getting silly. But he seems to be relaxing a little bit. The wife goes upstairs, and the two men are sitting on the couch watching television, which initially is almost, it seems insensitive when he says he gets up and he goes and he turns on the television because it's a blind man who's sitting there. And then the surprising thing again is, then the wife asks Robert, the blind man, well, do you have a television? He says, well, yeah, I have two. I have a black and white and a color. This is the early 80s, late 70s, so black and white TVs were still around. And, again, as a reader, it's like, oh, I'm a little shocked. Maybe I was making more snap judgments. So again, I'm being sort of sucked into this in this very postmodernist wave where the author is tossing out these little things and saying, okay, reader, don't be so passive. You're kind of in on this too. And they're watching television, and they start watching something about a cathedral. Or the Middle Ages with churches, or however he phrases it. On the screen, a group of men were wearing cowls and being set upon and tormented by men dressed in skeleton costumes and men dressed as devils. And that's just the first thing that they see. So again, snap surface judgment. Well, what is this about? I don't know what it's about, but this is what I see. And then it comes out over time that, okay, it seems to be some sort of a documentary program about cathedrals built in the Middle Ages in Europe, and okay, fine. It comes down to, they start talking about it, and the narrator says, you have any idea what a cathedral is? He says, yeah, literally. And again, look at the tight construction of this that comes out in the voice. Do you have any idea what a cathedral is, what they look like, that is? So his idea of a cathedral is completely tied up just in, well, what's the appearance? What does it look like? It's not necessarily anything that it does or anything that it inspires or any role that it plays in people's lives. It's just, well, what does it look like? And he dwells on the architectural details, again, hinting in this surprising voice every now and then that he has some education background. He talks about flying buttresses, which is it's not a super sophisticated term, but it is an architectural term, and gives a suggestion that, okay, this isn't a dummy. This guy has some, he knows a little something. And so he's able to identify certain exterior physical aesthetic qualities. The conversation they have starts to get weird. I mean, you make allowances for this by saying, well, all right, they are a little high at this point. They've been drinking for hours, and they broke out the weed, and they're, it's not super clear at this point. So you can allow them to be a little circuitous in their reasoning. Robert demonstrates, after he says, what do you know about Cathedral? Robert demonstrates, well, actually, he knows quite a few things. And he starts to rattle them off and saying, well, yeah, that's because the guy on the TV just said this, which means he's been paying attention. The blind man has been paying attention. And so the blind man has been able to learn something, to take something in, to see something that the sighted narrator seems oblivious to. And it gets down to this very peculiar ending where the blind man has him go and get some paper, and then the narrator and the blind man, Robert, draw this cathedral. And there's no indication that the narrator is a particularly good artist, but the idea is they sit down in front of a large piece of paper, they take out a pencil or a pen or something, and the blind man puts his hands on the narrator's hands, and the narrator's hands start to trace out the form of a cathedral. And you get a sense that there's something else going on here. There is something almost, there's something quite significant going on there, and significant in a very specific way, in that it means something. There is significance underneath the signification, the sign, the outward, the visible reality that is playing out in front of us has something underneath it that has meaning. And we're not quite sure what it is. It is a little opaque. It's almost at times like bordering on, I would say, the homoerotic, but the prevailing sense is that the narrator shuts his eyes and starts drawing, and then he said, I think that's it. I think you got it. He said, take a look. What is it? What do you think? Robert is telling the narrator to take a look, but I had my eyes closed. I thought I'd keep them that way for a little longer. I thought it was something I ought to do. Well, he said, are you looking? My eyes were still closed. I was in my house. I knew that. But I didn't feel like I was inside anything. It's really something, I said. Now, I'll bet that when everybody gets to that point in the story, they're going, that's it? What happened? I don't get it. You can be forgiven for that because it's baked into this, and you have to bring something to the experience of interpretation here. You get a sense of a kind of spirituality here, a kind of religious significance. Beneath the surface of this, he has struck on something that is a feeling. I feel, or I didn't feel like I was inside something. He's talking about a feeling rather than just the outward characteristics he's been drawing, and this sense of a sudden appreciation for what the cathedral might represent, for what it means on a more than just plastic level. It's all well and good to be able to identify what a flying buttress is. Bully for you. But understanding that sense of reverence, that sense of suspension, that bizarre quality of spirituality that comes through the surface once you start to look, once you pay attention, once you stop being so blind and look at something so that it becomes meaningful. And it becomes meaningful after all of this story where people have been sort of sniping or mainly the narrator, been very sarcastic, very resentful, very feeling isolated and vindictive and left out and angry. Here you get a sense that this feeling came about through experiencing someone else. He is learning to be, after all, by closing his eyes and drawing while he's going, he is learning to be like the blind man. And it is a moment of physical contact as well. Again, sort of a almost homoerotic moment. His fingers rode my fingers as my hand went over the paper. This is a very tactile moment where they are literally bonding physically and feeling their way through this experience together. And it takes that togetherness that brings about that religious quality. And there's the note that Carver was impressed by a documentary he had seen on Cathedrals about how they took, and they dwell on this sometimes, so long to make so many people coming together to build it. And in fact, there's the one line in there where the narrator says, so some people would spend their entire lives building this thing and then never get to see it because they would die before it was finished. And again, that sense of sight, always repeated, sight, blindness. He comes to that kind of sight at the very end, where that sense of he can see something more than just what's on the surface. And that is what's of value. That is what is special, what is meaningful, what has resonance for him and brings him along. And this is the whole postmodernist project of an extension of modernism, which is about getting through all of the dreck on the surface to find something within. And so you get a lot of language that does that, experiments with language that does that do that, because the language itself is very stripped down. We are never told, by the narrator, who is supposed to be somewhat inarticulate. The narrator never comes out and says, well, yeah, I was feeling very resentful, so I wasn't able to open up to this guy, and at the end I really learned my lesson. He never says anything like that. He just walks his way through his own thoughts in real time. And that's frustrating to deal with, but that's exactly what he has to go through in the story. The stripping away of all of the surface words and the language and the crappy emotions and the anger and the resentment and all of the cheapness in his life. This is what we all have to do to see through it and find something, anything, that gives us hope, that gives us a sense of beauty, that gives us a sense of togetherness and meaning and value in the world. That's what this story does.